Your Honor, her statement is pure fantasy. The words, spoken by an arrogant attorney named Mr. Davies, echoed in the sterile, wood-paneled judge's chamber. It's a desperate bid for attention. We have testimony from her own father that she's an unreliable narrator with a history of embellishment. I watched as my father, Richard, a man whose resentment was a constant simmering presence, nodded with a look of smug certainty. It was the same look he'd worn my entire life, the look that said I was a footnote in my own story. The judge glanced down, his expression unreadable, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought he might actually believe them. Then, the chamber door swung open. The sound was sharp, decisive. A uniformed Air Force JAG officer stepped inside, his posture ramrod straight. He was followed by me, in my own impeccable service dress, a row of medals on my chest that my family had never seen. I held a sealed, red-bordered folio against my chest, my knuckles white. Mr. Davies froze, his mouth half open as he stammered, "That's Lieutenant Reyes?" The finality of the moment settled when a full-bird colonel entered behind me, his gaze like ice. And the entire atmosphere of the room cracked under a sudden, immense weight of authority. 2 months earlier, the air was just as tense, but thick with a different kind of hostility. We were in a stuffy mediation office, gathered to discuss the will of my grandfather, a decorated Vietnam veteran, and the only person who ever truly saw me. He had left his service medals, his journals, and a significant portion of his estate to me, citing what he called my quiet, dedicated service to the nation. My father, a man who had washed out of officer candidate school and never forgave the world for it, was practically vibrating with rage. He pointed a finger at me, his voice dripping with condescension as he spoke to the mediator. "Look," he said, "my daughter is an administrative assistant at a base an hour away. She shuffles papers." The words were meant to diminish me, to paint me as small and insignificant. He went on, his voice rising. "She manipulated my father with these stories of some important government job. It's pathetic." The insult landed like a physical blow, a cold, hard knot in my stomach. It wasn't just another casual dismissal. Another birthday forgotten or achievement ignored. This was different. This was a weapon. He didn't just call me a liar in front of a mediator. He made my credibility the centerpiece of a legal battle. He had no idea he was challenging not just his daughter, but a commissioned officer of the United States Air Force. To understand the reckoning that followed, you have to understand the 2 lives I was forced to live. To my family, my life was a curiosity, a vaguely disappointing story they told themselves. It was a narrative written in broad, dismissive strokes, and it was never more clear than at our annual Thanksgiving dinner. The air was always thick with the smell of turkey and my mother's anxious energy. A woman who treated family peace like a fragile antique that might shatter at the slightest provocation. The centerpiece of every gathering, however, was my brother, Mark, the family's golden boy, who wore his charisma like a shield. He had a natural talent for being exactly what my parents wanted, a skill I had never managed to acquire. This year was no different. Halfway through the meal, my father, Richard, tapped his glass for attention, a triumphant smile on his face. "Everyone," he announced, his voice booming, "I want to propose a toast to my son, Mark, on his promotion to junior vice president at Sterling Financial." The room erupted. Aunts and uncles cheered, cousins whistled, and my mother beamed as if he'd just won a Nobel Prize. Mark soaked it all in, raising his glass with a practiced humility that made my stomach turn. I watched them celebrate his perfectly linear, perfectly understandable success, and felt the familiar chill of invisibility creep over me. It was the same chill I felt when they'd used my college fund to buy him a new car after he'd crashed. His, or the time they missed my valedictorian speech because he had a minor football scrimmage. Later, During a lull in the conversation, I made a quiet attempt to connect. "I actually got a commendation recently," I offered softly, "for a big project at work." My father, still glowing from his toast, turned and patted my hand with a distant sort of affection. "That's lovely, honey," he said, his eyes already drifting back toward his son. "It's good to have hobbies." And just like that, the conversation was over. He turned back to Mark, asking about market trends and stock portfolios, and I was left sitting there with my commendation, a piece of paper representing months of sleepless nights and crushing responsibility, reduced to a quaint little pastime, a hobby. I felt a cold, hard anger settle deep in my chest, a feeling I had learned to swallow down with turkey and pie for 2 decades. That hobby had a name. It was Operation Nightshade. My project was a cyber intelligence mission that had consumed the last 4 months of my life. The reality of my world was a universe away from the warmth and noise of that dining room. My reality was a skiff, a sensitive compartmented information facility, a place that was perpetually cold, silent, and bathed in the blue glow of dozens of monitors. There were no windows. There was no small talk. There was only the mission, a constant, humming pressure that demanded absolute perfection. Because a single mistake could have catastrophic consequences for the entire country. In that room, I wasn't the quiet, disappointing daughter. I was the mission commander. I remember one night, in the middle of the operation, when everything almost went sideways. Alarms blared, not with sound, but with silent, flashing red alerts across our screens. We had been breached. I stood at the head of the command table, my team of young, brilliant airmen looking to me, their faces tense. My voice was calm, cutting through the rising panic. "I need a full diagnostic on that data packet. Cross-reference the signature with the Iranian threat matrix," I commanded, my eyes scanning a waterfall of code. "I want a response vector plotted in the next 5 minutes, or we lose the asset." In that world, my words had weight. They had consequences. My team didn't pat my hand, they moved, their fingers flying across keyboards, executing my commands with a trust I had never known in my own family. We neutralized the threat with less than 30 seconds to spare. This was the world where I truly lived. It was a world of immense responsibility and quiet, earned respect. My commanding officer was Colonel Miller, a stern but fair leader who saw me in a way my own father never could. He was a man who measured worth not by job titles or income, but by competence under pressure. After we'd successfully concluded Operation Nightshade, he called me into his office. There was no fanfare, no grand announcement. He just looked at me from across his desk, a rare look of approval in his eyes. "Reyes," he said, his voice low and serious. "Your intelligence brief was the only thing that stopped Congress from pulling the plug on this program. Your work stays in the shadows, but up here, we know its value." His words were a validation so profound it almost hurt. This was my real life, the one I could never share, the one that made their dismissals feel so profoundly unjust. My father praised my brother for making money. My colonel praised me for protecting the nation, and I was trapped between these two realities, living a life of secret importance, while enduring a public existence of perceived mediocrity. The two worlds could never touch. Or so I thought. For years, I let them believe their version of my life because it was easier, because explaining the truth was impossible. But when my father weaponized my silence against me in a court of law, he forced my hand. He only respected rank and procedure. So I decided I would finally speak to him in the only language he understood. The official motion arrived in a crisp manila envelope. The legal language was dense, but the message was brutally simple. My father's lawyer was formally petitioning the court to have my testimony regarding my grandfather. Will thrown out, citing my questionable character and unverifiable career claims. I read the words over and over in my stark, orderly apartment, and I didn't feel sadness or even a fresh wave of anger. I felt a profound and chilling clarity. The years of trying to be heard, of hoping for a flicker of understanding. They were over. They had chosen their battlefield, a place of rules and evidence. And on that field, I had the advantage. I sat at my desk, the same one where I analyzed global threats, and I made a cold, precise decision. I would not fight this emotionally. Emotional appeals were their territory. A landscape of guilt, manipulation, and shifting goalposts where I always lost. No, I would respond with the one thing they couldn't argue with: procedure. I would use the unbending logic of the Uniform Code of Military Justice and federal law to deliver an undeniable, irreversible correction. My feelings were irrelevant now. This was a tactical problem that required a tactical solution. My fingers moved across the keyboard with a familiar, steady purpose. I drafted a formal memorandum, not to the court, but to my commanding officer, Colonel Miller, with a copy sent to the base JAG office. The words were carefully chosen, devoid of emotion, clinical and direct. I detailed how a civilian lawsuit was attempting to compel information about my service and was leveraging my inability to discuss classified duties as grounds to question my integrity. The subject line was my opening salvo: civilian legal action impinging on classified duties and service member credibility. With that one sentence, this stopped being a messy family squabble. It became a matter of institutional security. The response was immediate. Colonel Miller was, to put it mildly, furious. The institution I served so quietly in the shadows now moved to protect one of its own. The JAG office filed a motion to intervene and clarify service members' status with the civilian court. They requested a private, in-camera hearing with the judge to provide testimony that could not be made public. As I predicted, my father's lawyer, blinded by his own arrogance, agreed instantly. He saw it as a desperate bluff, a chance to finally expose the fantasist. The trap was set, perfectly baited. I had only one request for the JAG attorney: that Colonel Miller be present to deliver the testimony himself. My father's lawyer thought he was dragging a low-level clerk into court. He had no idea that by questioning my service, he had just summoned the full attention of the United States Air Force. The invitations were sent via official channels. They were walking into the judge's chambers for a family matter. I was walking in for a military proceeding. We stood outside the heavy oak doors of the judge's chambers. Through the wood, I could hear the muffled, confident drone of my father's lawyer, Mr. Davies, laying out his case. He was likely spinning the same tired narrative of the fantasist daughter, the unreliable clerk, who lived in a make-believe world. I stood at parade rest, my posture perfect, my expression unreadable. Beside me, my JAG officer gave a subtle nod, and behind us both, Colonel Miller stood like a statue. Carved from granite, his very presence a promise of the authority that was about to enter the room. This wasn't a courtroom, it was a theater, and the final act was about to begin. The JAG lawyer entered first. We heard him say, "Your Honor, to clarify my client's service record, we've brought her commanding officer, Colonel Miller." That was our cue. The door swung open, and I stepped across the threshold. All the air in the room seemed to rush towards us. I saw my father and his lawyer seated at one side of a large mahogany table, their postures relaxed and arrogant. The judge looked weary, impatient. Then their eyes fell on me, in my full-service dress uniform, and then on the full-bird colonel who followed me into the room. The change in my father was immediate and profound. The smug certainty vanished from his face, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed confusion. The color drained from his cheeks. This was something he understood on a cellular level, the rigid hierarchy of the military he had so desperately wanted to be a part of. He saw the silver eagle on Colonel Miller's shoulder, and his body reacted before his mind could. He instinctively straightened his spine, a flicker of subordinate deference in his eyes. He wasn't looking at his daughter anymore. He was in the presence of a superior officer, and he was completely, utterly out of his depth. The judge swore in Colonel Miller, his voice regaining a sharp edge of interest. My father's lawyer, though clearly rattled, tried to regain control, adopting a tone of dismissive curiosity. "Colonel," he began, "can you tell us what exactly Lieutenant Reyes does?" Colonel Miller fixed the lawyer with a stare so cold it could have frozen water. "No," he said, his voice quiet but carrying immense force. "I cannot. And I advise you not to ask again." He let the threat hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "What I can state for the record is this. Lieutenant Reyes is a cyber warfare officer. The paperwork her father so casually dismisses is threat analysis that has, on 3 documented occasions, prevented catastrophic failures in this nation's defense infrastructure. Each word was a perfectly aimed shot, dismantling years of my father's condescending narrative. The hobby had just been reclassified as a matter of national security." The lawyer began to stammer a response, but the colonel wasn't finished. He turned his attention to the judge, his tone becoming even more formal. "Your Honor, the statement Mr. Reyes is challenging was written by an officer who holds a top-secret PSI security clearance." A visible tremor of fear passed through the lawyer's body. This was no longer a civil matter. He had strayed into federal territory. "The process for that clearance," the colonel continued, "is one of the most exhaustive vetting procedures in the world. It examines a person's character, finances, and integrity down to the smallest detail. To suggest she is an unreliable narrator is not only insulting, it is patently absurd." Then came the final, devastating blow. Colonel Miller stepped forward and placed the sealed, red-bordered folio on the judge's desk. It landed with a soft, final thud. "These are her official commendation orders for actions during Operation Silent Shield," he stated. "They are classified, but they confirm her valor and integrity at the highest levels." The signature on the bottom is from General Morrison, Commander of Air Force Cyber Command. The name dropped into the suffocating silence of the room like a 10-ton weight. General Morrison, a legend in the intelligence community. My father looked like he had been physically struck, shrinking back in. His chair, his face a mask of dawning horror and public humiliation. The smug attorney was speechless, his complexion now a sickly gray. He had spent weeks slandering a highly decorated intelligence officer, and he finally understood the gravity of his mistake. The judge looked at the two of them, his expression now one of controlled fury. He slowly opened the folio, read a single line of text, and closed it decisively. He didn't need to see any more. I watched my father in that moment, and I didn't feel triumph. Not really. I felt a strange, quiet sense of pity. His entire world, a world built on his own perceived importance and my insignificance, had just been publicly and irrefutably demolished. My father had spent my whole life seeing me as a disappointment. In the end, it only took a 2-minute testimony for him to see me as my grandfather did, a soldier. The judge's gavel didn't come down with a crash, but with a quiet, final thud that seemed to absorb all the tension in the room. He looked at my father's attorney, his face a mask of judicial contempt. "The motion is dismissed with extreme prejudice," he stated, his voice dangerously low. "And, Counselor, I suggest you withdraw from this case entirely before I file for sanctions for filing a frivolous lawsuit and maligning a commissioned officer of the United States Armed Forces." The threat was not idle. My father's lawyer, who had been so confident just minutes before, seemed to shrink, nodding his head meekly. He and my father gathered their papers in a clumsy, defeated silence and left the chambers without once making eye contact with me. There was no dramatic confrontation, no tearful apology. There was just a quiet, pathetic exit, as the heavy door clicked shut behind them, sealing that chapter of my life for good. Colonel Miller placed a firm, steady hand on my shoulder. "Your grandfather would be proud, Lieutenant," he said. The words were simple, spoken without ceremony, but they landed with the force of a revelation. In that moment, I realized that this was the only validation I had ever truly needed. Not from the man who shared my blood, but from a man who shared my commitment to duty. It was everything. 1 year later, the title had changed. I was Captain Reyes now, and I was standing at a podium in a secure briefing room at the Pentagon. The audience wasn't a skeptical judge or a dismissive family, but a high-level, Joint Service Command group, their eyes fixed on me, hanging on my every word. I was briefing them on a new global cyber threat, my voice steady and confident as I laid out the intelligence my team and I had gathered. I was no longer hiding in the shadows or letting others define my worth. I was in my element, an acknowledged expert in my field, a leader whose analysis shaped national policy. I had finally become the person my grandfather had always seen. My real promotion ceremony, the one that mattered, hadn't been a grand affair. It was small, held on base, surrounded by the people who had become my true community. My squadron, my team, my family forged in duty and mutual respect, cheered loudly as the new rank was pinned on my collar. The person who did the honors was a man I had tracked down myself, a retired chief. Master Sergeant named Frank, my grandfather's oldest and dearest service buddy. He was a gruff old airman with kind eyes and hands weathered by a lifetime of service. As he carefully pinned the silver bars to my uniform, his own eyes welled with tears. "He always knew you had it in you, kid," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Always. In that moment, surrounded by the applause of my peers and the living memory of my grandfather, I felt a sense of peace that was absolute. This was my legacy. Not something inherited by name, but something earned, through action, and acknowledged by those who truly understood its meaning. It was a foundation so solid that nothing from my past could ever shake it again. The old wounds hadn't vanished, but they had scarred over, no longer tender to the touch. They were just a part of a story that had led me to where I was meant to be. A few weeks after the ceremony, a text message lit up my phone. It was from my father. 4 simple words. I saw the promotion list. "Congratulations." I looked at the message and I felt nothing. Not anger, not vindication, not even the ghost of a desire for more. The emotional ledger I had carried for so long was finally balanced, closed for good. My peace was no longer his to give or take. It was mine, built and paid for. I typed back a simple, polite thank you, and then I put my phone away, turning my full attention back to the mission briefing glowing on my screen. My future was my own, and I was no longer waiting for anyone's approval to live it. My father believed legacy was the name on a headstone. I learned it's the signature on a mission report that keeps people safe while they sleep. If you've ever had your quiet competence dismissed by people who should have been your biggest supporters, share your story in the comments below. In this community, your expertise is always mission critical.